By now you're probably aware of my love for Panasonic's GH4. It's an incredible little camera and I've made tons of content about it, so if you're unfamiliar with this camera or you don't think it's worth it, you should definitely check out some of my other videos because the GH4 is well worth the money. It's probably a steal at the price they're giving it away for practically. But we all know a GH5 is coming sooner, probably sooner rather than later. But what features should Panasonic include on the GH5? Because the GH4 is pretty good, but I think with these few additional features, the GH5 could be the camera that everyone needs to have. And the first thing that Panasonic could do is just offer higher frame rates. The GH4 has, 1080p 60 frames a second, and there is a kind of broken 96 frames per second mode where you can film a little bit slower, but the resolution and the quality just isn't there. So I'd really like to see with the GH5 something like 120 frames a second, because that is that sweet spot where, okay, you're not at the phantom level where you're, thousands of frames per second when you need that scientific super slow motion, but 120 is a lot nicer than 60. 60 is good to have if you want to do, that kind of slow motion, but having that ability to do 120 in my mind would just be phenomenal. That's kind of right where the Red cameras sit at their high end resolutions. They, 100, 120 frames per second, right around that area. And it's just a nice sweet spot where you can slow everything down. You can use Twixtor to slow it down even more if you need to, but you're not eating up the huge data rates of like filming with a Phantom, let's say. So you have a little bit more flexibility when you're filming to get that super slow motion, but not too slow. It's a really nice feature to have, especially on, let's face it, the GH5 will be a more consumer type camera. So I'm not expecting anything crazy high, up in the 1,000 frame rate, but 120 would be perfect. Another great feature to add to the GH5 would be better low light. The GH4 is an improvement over the GH3, GH2, and the GH1, but it can always get better, especially with competition from Sony with like the A7S that is just so good in low light. And, the 5D Mark III is also fairly good in low light. The GH4 just doesn't stand up to those cameras. So really pushing the low light capabilities of the GH5 would be really smart, in my opinion, for Panasonic to do, just because it's going to make it that much more attractive to those people who want or need that ability to shoot in low light. On the flip side of that, I'd like lower ISOs. Panasonic stripped the limitation of going down to ISO 100 in video mode, and you can only go down to ISO 200 in video mode. That is kind of limiting. Being able to go down to ISO 100 or even 50 in some cases helps you avoid having to use NDs. And there's always a trade-off between dynamic range and what's clipping and what's not. But having that in the camera, that ability to pop it down to ISO 100 or 50 would be really nice, especially with a camera that you kind of want to use in all these different situations. Low light, when you got too much light, and sometimes, throwing an ND on is time consuming and slow, and you don't always have that option, and you don't want to stop down on the lens because you want to keep that shallow depth of field. So just having a lower ISO as an option would be that extra icing on the cake. Probably not a necessity, but definitely a nice to have as kind of just another feature for the camera. I really want the GH5 to keep the ability to record to SD cards. That's one of my favorite things, as silly as it sounds, about the GH4, is that you can record to cheap SD cards. All the new modern cameras are adding, ProRes and RAW, and that's great. It's awesome, but leave those features for the higher end cameras so the people who want to pay for it, they can have it. But another trend is adding different, recording mediums like CFast or SSD or even compact flash. I love the fact that I can throw a cheap SD card in the GH4 and start rolling right away. I don't have to get some proprietary Sony S/S card or UXI or what. I don't even know all the Sony cards that they have. And Panasonic even has that with their P2 cards, and they're just so expensive. Red does it with their Red Mags and their SSDs that are just, they're overpriced. And I get it, it's proprietary, and they do their little special magic and they put their little mojo sauce on it to make it better or whatever. But at the end of the day, you just want footage on a card, and being able to do that for a low price, that's what I want. I don't want to have to pay for the name on the card or that you made it in a special factory. You know, I've never had an issue recording to regular SD cards with the GH4, so I hope the GH5 keeps that trend going forward. Another thing I'd love to see on the GH5 is in-body image stabilization. There are a lot of Panasonic Lumix lenses or Olympus lenses that are for Micro Four Thirds that have stabilization built in, but there's also the nice thing about mirrorless is you can use pretty much any lens ever on the camera. So on the GH4, I have a lot of old Nikon glass or even Canon lenses that I use that I can't have any kind of image stabilization. Having that built into the camera at the camera level will be so much better than having it on the lens. If you want it on the lens, you got to go buy some special proprietary lens, and they usually charge more for image stabilization. Put that in the body. Olympus has done it with a few of their cameras, and it works really, really well. If Panasonic can do that and add that to the GH5, oh my gosh, that's a huge reason to upgrade, especially from the GH4. And if they don't do any of these things, the GH5 is kind of like, all right, well, maybe you upgraded a few things here and there, but I don't really need it. But this would be a huge one because it means all your lenses, no matter what mount they're made for, what platform they're for, it doesn't matter. You get stabilization right at the camera level, and that's huge. I'd also like to see better dynamic range on the GH5. You know, the GH4 is pretty good, but it can always be better. So keep that in mind, Panasonic. Just make the GH5 better dynamic range. Why not? Another thing I'd like to see on the GH5 is a larger sensor. And that might be a little controversial because there are people who love Micro Four Thirds and they think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I'm not one of those people. I like the bigger sensor look. I like the shallower depth of field, or at least more control over my depth of field, so I can go shallow or I can go deep and it doesn't matter because I can pick it. With the GH4, you know, oftentimes I'm almost always shooting with a speed booster just because I like that look, the wider field of view, the shallower depth of field. And I get it. Panasonic has a lot of Lumix lenses that are made for Micro Four Thirds, and they probably don't cover a sensor size that's bigger. But it would be really beneficial, at least for me, to have a bigger sensor in the GH5. It would be a big marketing push to, you know, convince everyone that that's the right direction to move. But most people don't go with the Micro Four Thirds cameras simply because they have smaller sensors. You know, talk to anyone and they still think that a 5D Mark II, not talk to anyone, but some people think, you know, 5D Mark IIs, even for as garbage as the video quality is on that camera, still think it's better than the GH4 or GH3 or GH2 because it's got a bigger sensor. Or the Sony A7S that handles like garbage, like the handling on that camera is terrible and it doesn't record 4K internally. They still prefer that because it has the bigger sensor. So if Panasonic made, that'd be a radical move to put a bigger sensor in there, but I think they should, you know, at least Super 35. That would be a really nice, you know, and Super 35 that you can actually use in 4K mode. That's another thing I don't like about the GH4 Panasonic. I don't know why you got to crop in on my 4K video. You know, you already got a small enough sensor in there, and then you're going to crop in on it? Stop. Don't do that. Use the full sensor in 4K mode. And if it is Super 35 or something bigger than Micro Four Thirds, even if it's a big Micro Four Thirds sensor like the GH2 had, it was slightly bigger. So it was like a 1.89 crop or something like that. You know, that is even preferable. As big as we can get, because that is going to help sell the camera and convince all the people. There are so many people on the GH bandwagon. You know, I'm a fan, right? I like the cameras that Panasonic makes, but I'll say it again, the hardest thing to convince people to come to that platform and say, like, look how great this camera is. And the hang up they always have is that the sensor is too small. And if they fix that one issue, there are so many more people, photographers and videographers alike, you know, filmmakers who are going to be interested in a camera that has the bigger sensor. You know, people are spending thousands of dollars getting A7Ss and Atomos Shoguns and rigging it all out and doing the whole deal just so they can get full frame 4K. If the GH5 can do that internally, game changer. And the last thing I hope the GH5 sticks with is 4K resolution. There's probably people out there who want more. You know, they want 5K, 6K, 4.6K like on the Ursa Mini. But I think right now, especially with the GH5, it's not the biggest importance. You know, if they have to add more to the cost or into taking away from some of these other features just for the sake of adding, an extra 1,000 pixels horizontally or 2,000 pixels horizontally, I don't think it's worth it at this point, because even though 4K is quickly becoming the new standard, it's still not what most people are finalizing in. And I really like the GH4 because it allows me to shoot 4K and finalize in clean, sharp, crisp 1080p. And until we're finalizing almost all the time in 4K, I don't see the need for those higher resolutions just yet. Down the road, it will certainly happen, but that's maybe like a GH6 or GH7 if they make it up that high. But that's my list. I don't know if I missed anything. Maybe there's other stuff that you guys would like to see. Let me know. Or maybe you disagree. Maybe the larger sensor thing you think is a bad idea. Let me know. I'm really curious, because this is the kind of stuff, I will say, the one great thing about Panasonic, at least from their Lumix division, is they listen to us. They listen to the people on the internet talking about the cameras, because they know that we're the base that's going out to buy these things. And so they're listening to us, whether, they're checking every blog post and every video ever. Probably not. They probably never see this. But if we're vocal enough and we request these features and say, like, hey, look, this is what you need to do, because, there's so many different people working for the corporation that sometimes these decisions are hard to make. Should we add this extra feature for additional cost, or should we keep the camera cheap? And they're trying to do all these trade-offs all the time. And so if we give them a clear vision of what we're requesting, keep the SD card functionality, give us some higher frame rates, obviously do, better low light, and, maybe even do a bigger sensor and some of the other small features that you guys might have, put them out there, because hopefully they can pick up on it, and hopefully there's still time for them to implement some of this stuff in a GH5. Because for as good as the GH4 is, it's so close to being perfect. It's not. No camera will ever be perfect, but they're on that path. And I want to see Panasonic keep that momentum going and not cut any corners or pull anything back. They should keep charging ahead, because that's what's going to help them win the market. In my mind, there's no reason why anyone should buy anything other than like a GH4 or an A7S. Those two cameras are pretty much the pinnacle of what any one person would need. If you need low light, go with the A7S. If you need everything else, go with the GH4, right now at least. But I think Panasonic could dominate that market if they implemented some of these features in the GH5.